Hello. The Divine Code reading for July 14th, pages 73 and 74. This would be the conclusion to the chapter 3 on the prohibition against making a new religion or adding a commandment. Halakha number 9. Gentiles are obligated to give charity, whether as an individual or a community. They're obligated to be concerned about help for the poor and needy. Many organizations exist for the purpose of receiving and distributing charitable donations. Those who donate to organizations should take care about how their donations will be used. For example, if it will not be used for supporting idolatrous activities or for drawing Gentiles or Jews away from the faith of the Torah of Moses. So, okay, we have an obligation, both according to the Divine Code, we have an obligation both for the community and for the individual to help take care of the poor and the needy. Now, there is controversy concerning this. Some would say that the obligation is on the community, and there's rabbinic arguments to say that it's on the community, but it's not necessarily on the individual. Other people would say it's on the individual, but it's not on the community. I'm not sure if there's any rabbis that say that, but there are a lot of, it's within our culture, there's a lot of people that think that also. According to the Divine Code, the obligation is both on the individual and on the community for charity to help the poor and the needy. And the advice being given in the commentary is that we should make sure that the organizations that are involved in the charity are doing it from the heart of really helping the person. That's what they're trying to do, is really to help the person. They're not using it as a methodology for missionary work. To help them appropriately in any way possible. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed solely on account of the refusal to uphold and help the destitute, and their admonishment from their midst of any charity or help for the poor. Because of this, they were judged to deserve annihilation. This is described in Tractate Sanhedrin 104b, based on Ezekiel 16:49, and in other places. In Ezekiel, it mentions that the sin of Sodom was that they were not giving charity, and this is explained elsewhere that the nation of Sodom refused to give charity, and it was for that reason that they were destroyed. So that's the importance that a community has charity. Halakha number 10. Gentiles, and here we're talking about the community, Gentiles in a communal sense, are permitted to add any prohibitions in order to guard themselves against transgression or to establish a correct and orderly society. This is desirous as a part of observing the obligations of the Noahide Commandment to establish courts of law and develop proper societies in the world. Examples of Gentile societies that impose upon themselves restrictions against harassing women and children, and the punishments they set for such laws. The prohibition of adding a religion or a commandment does not apply to this because it is in keeping the Noahide obligations. It is part of keeping the Noahide obligations of establishing courts and laws and proper societies in the world. So societies can determine, okay, there's a Noahide law. Noahide laws against injuring people, whether that's in the understood from the prohibition against murder, or if it's understood against prohibition of stealing. We know there's a prohibition of injuring people, and therefore we can create extra rules saying, okay, the vulnerable in our society, like the women and the children, the vulnerable in our society, should be given extra protections so that they're not caused damages, they're not caused harm. This might go into regulations regarding slaughterhouses. We have a prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal. Therefore, logically, a government, a society, should have regulations regarding a slaughterhouse, saying that, oh, okay, we're going to require you to completely bleed out an animal. There needs to be a chain time, which, you know, the speed of the production line. There needs to be a wait before they actually start cutting parts of the animal off that might be used for consumption. This would be as an extra measure of protection. This only applies to restrictions Gentiles accept upon each other as communities to avoid damages. But if it is prohibited to add communal restrictions as if they were commanded by God, for example, a Gentile community that establishes a law against eating meat from unslaughtered animal carcasses, as if it were a transgression like eating meat that were slaughtered, that were severed from a living mammal or bird. Because this would be instituting a new religion. So if they're taking it as if it's the concern here is that these regulations might be seen as religious regulations. If we're protecting the women and children because it's proper to do so, that's one thing. But to make it a religious precept and say, okay, this is like a part of the Noahide code, and say it's a religious thing, that would be the concern. That is to say, they wish to restrict the community in this additional manner as a religious precept. Similar to this would be a law against eating pork, which is permitted for Gentiles, and the same applies to an individual if he adds it for himself as a religious precept. However, if a person wishes to restrict himself from eating meat from an unslaughtered carcass for the purpose of guarding his health, this is permitted. An individual is allowed to additionally restrict himself for a religious purpose if it is not in the manner of adding a new commandment. For example, a Gentile may restrict himself from eating any livestock or poultry meat as a complete safeguard against the prohibition of eating meat that was severed from a living animal. Or he may do this in a way to overcome a strong lust for the fresh butchered meat, if he feels it will make himself more pleasing to God through the self-refinement. So there's the two areas here. One is to safeguard himself from violating an actual commandment. In the case of restricting the consumption of freshly slaughtered meat, he could say, well, I got to be extra careful in this. Therefore, I'm not going to eat meat. Or maybe he's not going to eat fresh meat. He'll only eat frozen meat. Some kind of restriction to prevent the possibility of him eating the limb of a living animal. And in the area of handling the lust he has for fresh meat, therefore he's going to restrict meat from himself in order to curb his to curb his character. You give him a case of character refinement to help him in the area of becoming a better human being, becoming a better soul, so to speak, because he's refining himself through this action. The difference between a community and an individual is that an individual may set his mind and conviction to a specific personal purpose, but adding an unnecessary restriction upon a community is equivalent to instituting a decree with no logical purpose. For this, we can conclude that the private person may choose to become a vegetarian, since this can be explained as a rationalization or an emotional desire based on a personal aversion to killing living creatures for his food, which means that it is not based on a religious conviction. But to impose such a restriction on an entire community is definitely forbidden, because it amounts to adding a man-made decree that is unnecessary from a practical standpoint. So what the divine code would be saying, if I understand it correctly, is that if a community decided as a community that they wanted to do self-refinement communally, that puts it in the area of instituting religion. If they say that there's a characteristic that we want to develop in our community, we as a community we want to become more compassionate, and therefore we're going to open up a hospital in order to help us learn how to be more compassionate. That could be a concern. If the community said we want to open up a hospital so that injury does not occur, or we become responsive to injury, we want to have an emergency room in our neighborhood so that people don't inadvertently commit murder. There's a way to help in that area by having emergency services. Or they say they want to, the betterment of society, just the logistics of having a hospital in their neighborhood, it benefits the community. But if they're saying it for the purpose of developing compassion, the attribute of compassion within the community, that seems to be a concern, according to this. I would suggest that's an area that needs further study as to whether or not that may or may not be okay. But that seems to be what's being explained here. Thank you.